It's the 2nd August of the 1960s. President Kennedy is entering his 7th month in the presidency. It's 4 months after the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion. After going to bed on Saturday night, people wake up to a giant, barbed wire-topped, immobile snake constructed in that one night to keep Berlin's people immobile. Military footings are heightened, there is worldwide condemnation, and Kennedy's administration talk their talk. Better stock a bit more in the fallout bunker. But privately, Kennedy is almost as pleased as Khrushchev and Albrecht, although not for the same reasons. If he would be more public about his relief, it could calm public fears. But he can't, because doing so might provoke the bear too much. How did Kennedy react behind closed doors and windows, still so fresh in the role as president, as the August crisis, rather thankfully, didn't become the Berlin missile crisis? In the late 50s, but especially the early 60s, Berlin was becoming a PR embarrassment to not only East Germany, but the Eastern Bloc as a whole. And when people looked in the GDR's direction, they were usually looking overhead towards Moscow. People had been fleeing from East Berlin to the west ever since the city's partition, but now this was starting to accelerate. Many who had believed in the German Democratic Republic when it was first created, or at least had been ambivalent about it, or were apolitical, had now become disillusioned, or believed there was a place where the grass really was greener. A dozen years of defections had created a lot of word of mouth through Berlin and Germany as a whole, east or west. As the newfangled television is now affordable enough that 9 out of 10 households own one, the world can actually see these defections. And by August 1961, the hundreds occurring daily have reached thousands. And what better image for the screen and better timing than 1961's Miss Universe being the Soviet zone Cinderella, winning the crown for the Federated Republic of Germany less than a year after leaving the GDR. Although this is bad news for authorities in the Eastern Bloc, they, especially Premier Khrushchev, see it as occurring at an opportune moment. For the US president is no longer the celebrated World War II general who brought victory across Europe, but a pretty boy, smooth talker who won the presidency in part by looking good on the screen, who just 3 months into his presidency has presided over a humiliation at the Bahia de Cochinos. Khrushchev thinks he can intimidate the young man in short pants, as he dubs Kennedy. Why not? 5 days before the Bay of Pigs, Yuri Gagarin had become the first man in space. And he does. President Eisenhower, the only previous US president that Khrushchev had had to face as premier, had largely dismissed Khrushchev's threats and bravado. As a former general, Ike probably knew how to handle it or saw it for what it was. But President Kennedy, on the other hand, believes Khrushchev is serious and doesn't know how to handle these kinds of confrontations. It is a totally alien style of diplomacy for him. As president, Kennedy has talked about easing tensions and of making peace. In the political language he has learnt, this should be understood as an olive branch and be met with neutral sentiments. But instead, Khrushchev, known for being rather brusque and fairly hostile when conducting diplomacy, at least from the average in international relations, steps it up to a level that he hasn't previously with Kennedy. This is the man whose image was shown over the world banging his shoe on a podium in anger at the UN General Assembly. Khrushchev has long made statements that West Berlin should come under East German control, and months into this new US administration, he now sees the chance. As such, Hurricane Nikita was chomping at the bit to meet Kennedy face to face. In June, they meet for the first time in Vienna to discuss the situation in Berlin. It's one thing to see your counterpart in carefully crafted speeches or political statements meant for different audiences or situations. It's another to meet face to face, especially away from an audience. But the meeting appears to confirm the thoughts that Khrushchev has been forming, and even he is genuinely surprised about how weak Kennedy appears when they meet. Likewise, Kennedy about how aggressive Khrushchev continues to be, even when there is no political base to appeal to or camera to be aware of. Kennedy had assumed that when meeting personally, the father of the four, as he is known in the USSR, will at least thaw somewhat. But as Kennedy later remarks to James Reston of the New York Times, the Vienna summit was, quote, the roughest thing in my life. As W.R. Smizer writes, the Soviet premier, quote, used the kind of language that a Russian might use with a younger man who needed to be taught his manners. He threatens again and again to seize West Berlin and comes away convinced that Kennedy would probably retreat in Berlin in order to preserve wider peace. Even McGeorge Bundy is astounded by Khrushchev's brazenness. Kennedy sums it up to Reston, I've got a terrible problem. If he thinks I'm inexperienced and have no guts, until we remove those ideas, we won't get anywhere with him. Like, share and subscribe for more Cold War. During the 2 months between the summit and the construction of the wall, wherever Kennedy is, his mind is not far from Brandenburg. Like a despondent schoolchild, his notepad pages for White House meetings are dotted with scribbles, scrawling the word Berlin over and over, even when the topic is something else. As East Berliners leave in increasing numbers every day, Kennedy privately believes it is very likely that Khrushchev plans to follow through with his threats to take West Berlin, and that probability increases each time another person defects. In the first 11 days of August, the number of defectors taking advantage of the open border will total 16,000. Kennedy and his aides know they must do something. He responds by declaring publicly that whatever happens in the coming months, the US would act to defend 3 things: the Allied presence and Allied troops, meaning American troops, in West Berlin, Allied surface and air access to West Berlin, and the freedom and viability of West Berlin. Although Kennedy's statements sound offensive, they provide an opening of some kind for the GDR, in that they essentially signal to the East German and Soviet leaders that they can do what they like in East Berlin. Kennedy himself remarks to aides that Secretary Ulbricht might likely build a physical barrier to stop the outflow of East Berliners. It seems with each passing day that whatever he or Khrushchev do, the East German government will ultimately end up doing something by themselves. As he says to an aide, I can hold the alliance together to defend West Berlin, but I cannot act to keep East Berlin open. As the second week of August approaches its end, the weekend arrives, and a new record occurs on Saturday the 12th, as 2,400 people cross from East to West Berlin, the highest number there has ever been in a single day. Over the last year or more, the worldwide attention on these flights has never been higher. Most people might assume that from the East German government's perspective, the issue for them is the international shame. But for them, it's equally an issue of economics and population as much as anything else, as workers are suddenly not in workplaces and families are becoming broken up. Although their economic model isn't the greatest that the world has ever seen, to put it mildly, these defections exacerbate their economic issues, not to mention the effectiveness of government narratives. So, on Fidel Castro's birthday, because that's always a great day to do such things, Augusts were always eventful during the Cold War, maybe something to do with the summer heat. In the early hours before the dawn on August 13th, East German Volkspolizei began unrolling barbed wire at the Potsdamer Platz. Military trucks transporting barbed wire and concrete posts were unloaded all along the sector border, and access across any streets from east to west Berlin were to be blocked before sunrise. Although the intention was to sever access to West Berlin discreetly during the midnight hours so the populace would be unaware, the train stations had nevertheless become jammed with civilians before daybreak, trying to escape before the war was completed, but were prevented from doing so by armed East German police. Of course, the population themselves were unarmed. Whereas escapes were not publicized before in East Germany, escapes to West Berlin will now actively be publicized, and much for the same reason. Publicly, the shock, horror and outrage created by the anti-fascist protection barrier, as it is championed and called in East Germany, creates increased fear of escalation, war in Berlin or along the Iron Curtain at large, and of course, nuclear conflict. As although it is a directive of the East German government, it looks like the Soviets have finally acted in Berlin. Likewise, the situation appears to escalate, as within a week Kennedy has sent a battle group to West Berlin, along with Vice President Johnson, calling the Soviets' bluff of a potential block of the Autobahn to West Berlin. But privately, although tensions are still high, most of the key political players are calmed by the creation of the wall. Rather than escalation, it very literally partitions and cements the current boundaries further. That weekend, JFK had been staying in Hyannisport and is informed of the construction of the wall by a military aide. Kennedy, who had been fearing Khrushchev's conviction that West Berlin could be taken without retaliation, at least certainly from the Kennedy he'd seen and dealt with so far, immediately feels that it is a dark positive in the context of realpolitik, and a large amount of weight lifts from his shoulders. As Smizer writes, quote, Khrushchev had solved his most urgent problem without trying to cut Allied access or violate Allied rights, as Kennedy saw them. With the construction of the wall, Khrushchev had not only not moved on West Berlin like Kennedy had feared was very likely, but the construction of the wall did not infringe on the three things Kennedy had demanded 3 weeks earlier. American troops could remain in West Berlin, West Germany could still access West Berlin, and the freedom of West Berlin was retained. Discussing the unfolding situation with aides, Kennedy says, why would Khrushchev put up a wall if he really intended to seize West Berlin? There wouldn't be any need for a wall if he occupied the whole city. This is his way out of his predicament. The Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Roy Kohler, phrased it in fewer words. The East Germans have done us a favour. Kenny O'Donnell will remark that although the president is disgusted by the war, he says that despite it not being a very nice solution, the wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Despite their relationship to this point having been dominated by Khrushchev seeing Kennedy as someone always ready to back down, for the first time Kennedy sees that Khrushchev might be able to back down or may not be the opponent he had first believed. As ironic as it might seem, the construction of the wall actually marks a small step towards a possible peace treaty, or at the least some kind of détente, which of course would become the main Cold War policy in the administrations after Kennedy's and Khrushchev's. As ironic as it might seem, the construction of the wall actually marks a small step towards a possible peace treaty, or at the least some kind of détente, which of course would become the main Cold War policy in the administrations after Kennedy's and Khrushchev's. To Khrushchev and the communist ideology, the war was not imposed by themselves as much as imposed by a necessity, by Western influence. Hence its name, the anti-fascist protection rampart. Their way of thinking sees most of the issues in the Eastern Bloc as stemming from the imperialist and fascistic influence of the capitalist nations. So, if this is indeed correct, closing off the open border between the FRG and GDR was just a necessity. International condemnation merely confirmed such reasoning. Despite all of Khrushchev's talk of taking West Berlin, the justifications used for having done so would have been the same as those used for the construction of the wall. So, like Kennedy, Khrushchev sees it as an acceptable compromise in the situation. So the wall was, as Freddie said, a built-in remedy for Khrushchev and Kennedy, at least until round 2 the next year in Cuba. But for Kennedy and Khrushchev, the word remedy might have been said in a different tone from the way Berliners might have used it. It becomes, and still is, the physical embodiment of the Cold War.